On June 7th, 2023, a 58-year-old Central Illinois farmer named Earl Braddock walked into the parts counter at Reinhardt Implement in Champaign, Illinois, at 9:14 in the morning and asked for a hydraulic cylinder seal kit for his John Deere 6155R. The part number was RE271434. He had ordered the same kit 18 months earlier, in December of 2021, and paid $118.50 for it. The parts clerk, a young man named Kyle who had been working the counter for about 8 months, typed the number into the computer, waited for the screen to load, and said, "That's going to be $487.40. Earl asked him to repeat the number. Kyle repeated it. $487.40 for the same seal kit, the same part number, the same rubber O-rings, the same backup rings, the same dust seals, packaged in the same green and yellow box with the same running Deere stamped on the side. The price had increased from $118.50 to $487.40. That was a 311% increase in 18 months. Earl did not buy the seal kit. He thanked Kyle, walked out of the dealership, sat in his pickup truck in the parking lot for 4 minutes, and then drove 26 miles home. He did not turn on the radio. He was not angry in the way that shows, not red-faced, not clenching the steering wheel, not muttering. Earl Braddock processed things the way Central Illinois processes weather, slowly, deeply, and with consequences that don't arrive for months. But he was thinking. He was thinking about $487.40 for a seal kit that contained less than $14 worth of rubber and spring steel. He was thinking about the fact that the same seal kit from an aftermarket supplier, same dimensions, same materials, same specifications, was available online for $41.75. He was thinking about what $487.40 meant multiplied across every hydraulic cylinder, on every tractor, on every farm in Ford County. And he was thinking about Tom Lindquist's spiral notebook. Tom Lindquist was 63 years old, farmed the section adjacent to Earl's north boundary, and had been secretary of the McLean County Farm Bureau for 9 years. Tom was the kind of man who documented everything, not because he was paranoid or litigious, but because he believed that information was the only weapon a farmer had against institutions that operated on the assumption that farmers didn't keep records. Tom's spiral notebook was legendary in the county. He had been carrying the same brand, Meade 5-Star, college-ruled 100 sheets, since 1987, and he went through roughly 4 per year. He wrote down grain prices, planting dates, rainfall amounts, equipment costs, and the names and phone numbers of every person who told him something worth remembering. His handwriting was small, precise, and perfectly legible. He did not use a computer. He did not use a phone app. He used a pencil, a yellow Dixon Ticonderoga, No. 2, always sharpened, always behind his right ear. And he wrote things down. If you value stories about the equipment decisions that define a farm, the ones made in quiet, carried for decades, and never forgotten, this channel tells them. We don't rush, we don't sell, we just remember. Earl called Tom that evening. He told him about the seal kit. Tom was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How much did you say it was in 21? Earl said $118.50. Tom said, "Hold on." and Earl heard the sound of a notebook page turning. Then Tom said, "I've got 43. Earl asked what he meant. Tom said, 43 price increases on Deere OEM parts since January of 2022. I've been tracking them." Tom had been walking into Reinhardt Implement once a month for the past 18 months, pricing 10 common maintenance parts, seal kits, filters, belts, bearings, hydraulic hoses, electrical connectors, and writing down the prices next to the previous month's prices. He had a running log. The average increase across all 43 documented changes was 147%. 7 parts had increased by more than 200%. The hydraulic seal kit Earl had just been quoted was the worst, 311%, but it was not an outlier. It was the trend line. Tom asked Earl if he wanted to see the notebook. Earl drove over the next morning. They sat at Tom's kitchen table, a farmhouse table that had been in the Lindquist family since Tom's grandfather built it in 1952 from walnut trees he'd felled on the property. And Tom laid out the numbers. Page after page, in neat pencil columns, the prices marched upward like a staircase built by someone who assumed nobody was watching. Oil filters for a 6R series, $24.50 in January the 2022. $52.10 by June 2023. Hydraulic return filter, $67 to $100 to $49.80. Primary fuel filter, $31.40 to $78.50. Fan belt for an 8R, $44 to $112.30. Every number was dated. Every number was sourced from the same counter at Reinhardt Implement. The consistency of the data was devastating, not because any single price was catastrophic, but because the pattern was unmistakable. Deere was systematically repricing its entire OEM parts catalog to capture revenue from the installed base of aging equipment that farmers could not afford to replace. Earl looked at the notebook and said, "What are we going to do about it?" Tom looked at him over the top of his wire-rimmed glasses and said, "I think we need to talk to Bryce Callahan." Bryce Callahan was 47 years old and farmed 1,200 acres of corn and soybeans near Saybrook, Illinois, 18 miles northeast of Gibson City. Bryce was built like a man who had been loading grain bins since he was 14. Broad-shouldered, 6'1", 220 pounds, with a thick red-brown beard trimmed to 1 inch and hands that could palm a basketball or torque a lug nut without a breaker bar. He drove a maroon Dodge Ram 2500 with a welding rig in the bed and a bumper sticker that said nothing. The bumper sticker spot was empty, which told you everything about Bryce Callahan's approach to public statements. He spoke in a low baritone, direct and unhurried, and people listened to him, not because he was loud, but because he only opened his mouth when the words were worth the air. Bryce had been the McLean County Farm Bureau's Equipment Committee Chair for 3 years. He had organized the county's group seed buying program in 2019, negotiating a 12% discount from a regional distributor by consolidating orders from 31 farms. He understood leverage. He understood that 50 farmers buying separately had no power. But 50 farmers buying together had the only power that mattered in a market dominated by 3 equipment manufacturers. Tom called Bryce on June 9th. Bryce listened to the numbers. Then he said 4 words, "Set up a meeting." The meeting happened on June 22nd, 2023, At the American Legion Post 54 in Saybrook, Bryce had reserved the hall for 2 hours. Tom had made photocopies of his notebook pages, 43 price increases, laid out in a 4-page handout with the part, numbers, descriptions, old prices, new prices, and percentage increases organized in a table that Tom had drawn by hand with a ruler. Earl had contributed something simpler. 2 receipts for the same hydraulic seal kit, RE 271434, side by side. $118.50 on the left, $487.40 on the right. Same part, same box, same dealer. 18 months apart. 38 farmers showed up. They came in pickups and work trucks, their headlights swinging across the Legion's gravel parking lot between 6:30 and 6:55, because farmers arrive early for everything except their own funerals. They wore caps and Carhartts and boots caked with the dirt of the specific farms they depended on. They filled the folding chairs that the Legion's post commander, a Vietnam veteran named Harold Foss, had set up in rows of 8. Harold didn't ask what the meeting was about. He just unlocked the building, turned on the coffee maker, and put out the styrofoam cups. In Saybrook, when Bryce Callahan reserved the hall, people came. That was how it worked. The farmers drank coffee and looked at the handout Tom had placed on every chair. Nobody spoke for the first 3 minutes. They just read the numbers. A man named Walt Pomeroy, who ran 960 acres of corn south of Chenoa, turned the handout over to see if there was more on the back. There wasn't. The front was enough. Earl sat in the second row between Tom and a young farmer named Keith Steffens, who had just taken over his father's operation and was running 2 Deere tractors on 480 acres with no margin for error. Keith was 26 years old. He had been farming independently for 8 months. He looked at the handout and then looked at Earl and said quietly, "Is this real?" Earl said, "Every number is from the same counter." Keith nodded and said nothing else. The room smelled like coffee and diesel and the particular silence of men who are calculating how much money they've lost without knowing it. Bryce stood at the front of the room at 7:08 p.m. and spoke for 11 minutes. He did not give a speech. He stated facts. He said that the average Central Illinois grain farm spent between $12,000 and $28,000 per year on OEM replacement parts. He said that the price increases documented in Tom's notebook, if applied across a typical operation, represented an additional $14,000 to $31,000 in annual parts costs compared to 2 years earlier. He said that aftermarket equivalents, same specifications, same materials, manufactured by the same suppliers who made the OEM parts before Deere rebranded them, were available at 60 to 80% below the current Deere OEM price. He said that the barrier to buying aftermarket was not quality, it was access. Individual farmers ordering online were paying retail shipping, waiting 5 to 7 business days, and gambling on supplier reliability. A cooperative, a single purchasing entity representing multiple farms, could negotiate wholesale pricing, establish vendor relationships, maintain parts inventory locally, and guarantee 2-day delivery within the membership area. He asked for a show of hands. Who would be willing to join a cooperative purchasing group if one were organized? 34 of the 38 farmers raised their hands. Tom Lindquist wrote down the number in his notebook. Then he turned to a fresh page and started taking names. the Central Illinois Agricultural Repair Cooperative, CIARC, which everyone pronounced CIARC within a week, was formally incorporated on August 14, 2023, as a 501(c)(12) agricultural cooperative under Illinois state law. Bryce Callahan was elected president. Tom Lindquist was elected secretary-treasurer. Earl Braddock was elected to the board of directors, along with 4 other farmers representing operations from 320 to 2,400 acres. Initial membership was 54 farmers. The original 34 from the Saybrook meeting, plus 20 more who joined after word spread through the Farm Bureau network, the grain elevator waiting lines, and the particular rural grapevine that moves faster than any broadband connection because it runs on trust instead of fiber optics. Each member paid a $200 annual membership fee. The money came in checks and cash over the course of 3 weeks. Some handed to Tom at Farm Bureau meetings, some mailed to a P.O. box that Bryce set up at the Saybrook Post Office, and one delivered by a 71-year-old retired dairy farmer named Glenn Yoder, who drove to Bryce's farm on a Sunday afternoon, handed over $200 bills, folded inside a church bulletin, and said, "I don't have any Deere equipment anymore, but I want to be part of this." He was member number 48. The cooperative startup capital was $10,800. Tom counted it twice, recorded it in the notebook, and deposited it at the First National Bank of Gibson City on August 16th, where the teller asked what kind of organization CIARC was. Tom said, "Farmers buying their own parts." The teller said, "Good for you." Bryce personally guaranteed the first wholesale account with a parts distributor in Indianapolis, a company called Great Plains Ag Supply that supplied aftermarket equivalent parts for Deere, Case IH, AGCO, and Kubota equipment. The distributor offered CIARC a 35% discount below their standard wholesale price in exchange for a minimum monthly purchase commitment of $8,000. Bryce calculated that 54 farms spending an average of $1,400 per month on parts would generate $75,600 in monthly volume, nearly 10 times the minimum. The math was not close. The math was overwhelming. CIARC's parts depot was a 30 by 40 metal building on Bryce Callahan's property, which he donated rent-free for the first year. Tom Lindquist built the inventory management system, not on a computer, but in a 3-ring binder with tab dividers for each equipment brand, each part category, and each member's purchase history. He updated the binder every Saturday morning. His wife, Carol, told him he was the last man in America still running a business with a pencil and a binder. Tom said the pencil had never crashed, never needed a software update, and never charged him a subscription fee. Carol said that wasn't the point. Tom said it was exactly the point. The first order shipped on September 4th, a pallet of hydraulic seal kits, oil filters, and fuel filters that arrived at Bryce's building on a freight truck at 2:15 in the afternoon. Tom was there to receive it. He checked every box against the packing slip, penciled a check mark next to each item in the binder, and arranged the stock on the shelving units that Bryce had welded together from angle iron and scrap steel. The shelves were not beautiful. They were straight, strong, and labeled. They looked exactly like what they were, something built by a man who understood that function outlasts decoration. By October of 2023, CIARC had processed 412 parts orders totaling $187,300 in member purchases. The average savings per order, compared to Deere OEM pricing at Reinhardt Implement, was 67%. One farmer, a corn and soybean operator named Russell Engel, who ran 3 Deere tractors and a combine on 1,800 acres near Colfax, calculated that his CIARC purchases had saved him $11,400 in the first 3 months alone. He brought the calculation to the October membership meeting, written on the back of a seed corn invoice, and held it up for the room to see. Nobody clapped. Farmers don't clap. But 37 men nodded simultaneously. And in that room, on that night, a nod was louder than applause. By the end of 2023, CIARC's first-year savings across all 54 member farms totaled $690,000. $690,000 that had previously gone to John Deere's parts division through its authorized dealer network was now circulating within the cooperative, paying for aftermarket parts at fair prices, paying for Bryce's building maintenance, paying Tom's office supplies, pencils, notebooks, binder tabs, and accumulating in a reserve fund that the board voted to designate for a future purpose, hiring an independent mechanic to serve the cooperative's membership at a flat rate of $65 per hour. The cooperative changed more than purchasing patterns. It changed conversations. At the grain elevator in Gibson City, at the Farm Bureau meetings in Bloomington, at the seed corn dealer's office in Lexington, farmers who had previously accepted Deere OEM pricing as an immovable fact of life were now comparing prices, sharing part numbers, and asking each other a question that had never been asked before. What are you paying for that? The question itself was revolutionary. For decades, parts pricing had been a private transaction between a farmer and a dealer counter. Nobody compared, nobody questioned. The price on the screen was the price, the way gravity was gravity, a force you accepted because fighting it seemed pointless. CIARC had not eliminated gravity. It had demonstrated that there was another way to stand. Reinhardt Implement felt the impact before the year was out. Their OEM parts counter revenue dropped 19% in the fourth quarter of 2023 compared to the same quarter in 2022. The parts manager filed a report with the regional Deere distribution center, noting competitive pressure from aftermarket sources in the McLean-Ford-Livingston County area. The report was forwarded to Deere's Aftermarket Strategy Division in Moline. A regional account manager was assigned to investigate. He visited Reinhardt in January of 2024, reviewed the sales data, and recommended a market-responsive pricing adjustment on 126 high-volume maintenance parts. The adjustment took effect in February. The average reduction was 22%. Earl Braddock received the updated Reinhardt price list in his mailbox on February 14, 2024. He opened it at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd looked at Tom's notebook 8 months earlier. He found part number RE271434, the hydraulic cylinder seal kit, on page 3. The new price was $289, down from $487.40. Still $170.50 more than it had been in December of 2021. Still $247.25 more than the aftermarket equivalent that CIARC stocked in Bryce Callahan's metal building. Earl looked at the number for a while. Then he folded the price list and put it in the filing cabinet, in the manila folder behind the 23 service receipts, behind the 2 side-by-side seal kit receipts he'd shown at the Saybrook meeting, and ahead of the CIARC membership certificate that Tom Lindquist had printed on his home computer and signed in pencil. Earl understood what the price reduction meant. It meant that John Deere, a corporation with $61.3 billion in annual revenue, 83,000 employees, and a market capitalization larger than the GDP of most countries, had noticed that 54 farmers in central Illinois had stopped buying parts at 311% markup. It meant that the aftermarket strategy division in Moline had done the math that Tom Lindquist had done with a pencil and a notebook 9 months earlier and arrived at the same conclusion. The prices were indefensible. It meant that a 22% reduction was not generosity. It was acknowledgement, and acknowledgement, in Earl's experience, was the first thing a corporation offered when it realized the alternative was irrelevance. But Earl also understood something else, something he did not say out loud, because it was the kind of thought that sounded arrogant when spoken and obvious when lived. The price reduction proved that the original prices had been a choice, not a cost, not a supply chain necessity, not an unavoidable consequence of raw material inflation, a choice. Deere had chosen to charge $487.40 because it could. And now it was choosing to charge $289 because it had to. The difference between those two numbers, $198.40, was not savings. It was the shape of the power that 54 farmers in central Illinois had built from a spiral notebook and a meeting in an American Legion hall. The cooperative didn't celebrate. There was no victory meeting, no press release, no social media post. Bryce Callahan mentioned the Deere price adjustment at the March membership meeting in a single sentence. Deere dropped some prices. Ours are still lower. Tom Lindquist wrote down the new Deere prices in his notebook in a fresh column next to the old prices, with the date and the percentage of the reduction. He did not write the word because. He didn't need to. The spiral notebook told the story in numbers, and numbers don't need conjunctions. On the morning of June 7th, 2024, exactly 1 year after Earl had stood at the Reinhardt parts counter and heard the number $487.40, he drove to Bryce Callahan's property to pick up a set of hydraulic hoses for the 6155R. The metal building was open, the fluorescent lights on, Tom's binder on the counter. Earl signed the purchase log. Tom insisted on signatures, the way Tom insisted on everything that created a record, and loaded the hoses into his pickup. On the way out, he passed a maroon Dodge Ram 2500 with a welding rig in the bed. Bryce was underneath a neighbor's grain cart, welding a cracked frame member, wearing a dark canvas vest and a welding hood tipped up on his forehead. He waved at Earl with a gloved hand. Earl waved back. Neither of them said anything. In central Illinois, between farmers who have built something together, a wave is a complete sentence. The Central Illinois Agricultural Repair Cooperative has 61 members now. The original 54, plus 7, who joined in the first quarter of 2024, after hearing about it at the McLean County Farm Bureau annual meeting. The parts depot in Bryce's building, stocks 340 SKUs across 4 equipment brands. Tom Lindquist's 3-ring binder has been supplemented, reluctantly, by a shared spreadsheet that his granddaughter set up on a laptop she bought him for Christmas. Tom still keeps the pencil notebook as a backup. He says the spreadsheet is fine, but the notebook is truth. Earl Braddock still farms 640 acres of corn and soybeans outside Gibson City. The 6155R has new hydraulic seals, aftermarket, installed by Earl himself in his machine shed. Total cost $41.75 plus a Saturday afternoon. The seals work perfectly. They are made of the same rubber, by the same manufacturer, in the same factory in Ohio. The only difference is the box they came in. One box has a running Deere on it, the other doesn't. The hydraulic oil can't tell the difference. Neither can the cylinder.